Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. How much power does social media have over our lives? A question that we continuously go back to as news stories emerge and as scandals related to social media giants are uncovered. And after a newly released Netflix documentary titled The Social Dilemma, we are once again forced to reckon with this question. On today's show, we hope to put together the pieces that would give us perhaps a more clear picture of how deeply social media impacts our lives. So let's introduce our guests who will help us do just that. Joining us today is Shmyla Khan, who's the Research and Policy Director at Digital Rights Foundation. She joins us from Lahore. Also joining us today is Hija Kamran, who's the Digital Rights Lead at Media Matters for Democracy. She joins us from Karachi. Thank you both for joining us and a very, very warm welcome to the show. Hija, let me begin with you. Now, in many ways, what this documentary talks about are issues that we have all become familiar with because there's so much that has happened in the social media world, whether it's in terms of scandals, privacy breach, whatever. We know that there's a certain type of insidiousness attached to this realm. But do you feel like it uncovers anything new?
I think from the perspective of how I have seen the documentary and how I'm sure a lot of other people have also seen it or will see it, it does not really offer, insight into how we experience social media or what needs to be done with the problems that we face on social media. For example, the documentary, paints this dark picture of, all of the social media platforms that we use. For example, there is an, enactment of this, middle class US family where a teenager is addicted to social media, and this other, her brother is also sort of addicted, and also he is seen, attracted towards this political polarization of the right-wing politics or whatever they have shown in the documentary. He seems to be attracted towards that, but then again, they do show that these problems exist in the society, and then it also sort of implies that this is because of the social media or this is because of the internet. Now, we agree, or actually I agree, that these are the problems on the internet, that we sort of fail to draw the line of where to stop using in the internet or where to stop scrolling on social media. But at the end of the day, we cannot discount the fact that social media has also helped people in how our society works or how we experience the world right now. I'll give you a local example. Aurat March it has become a big movement in Pakistan. It originated, or rather it gained momentum on social media. The whole Me Too movement globally got its, the attraction that it has currently, basically got it from social media also. And you cannot really, just say that social media is the evil force that needs to be, that needs to be that people need to stop using right now. That is what the social dilemma actually says when, all of these executives, former executives of Facebook, Twitter, and all of these, Amazon or Google, they sit together and they're asked, what is the solution of all of these problems that we experience? They clearly do not have any answer, and they just say that we do not let our kids use social media, we do not want people to use social media, and to say that people just need to stop using the internet, it's also coming from a privileged point of view, because not a lot of people can actually afford stop using social media.
Right, and here you give us a local example. There are so many other instances in which we can see the role of social media, the positive role of social media, whether it's the Sudan revolution, whether it's the Black Lives Matters movement in the United States. So much of grassroots movements being organized, almost all of what happens when you really can't come out on the streets, but you need to organize behind the scenes, happens on social media. So it provides a valuable platform. But one thing that I do want to pick on here, and I think it's important to highlight and talk about it, Shmyla, I'll take this to you, is what the documentary and what in general when we see and when we talk about social media is the role it has in manipulating us. and this persuasive technology, the use of persuasive technology. What really is that?
Yeah, I think what Hija picked up on, sort of the composition of the documentary, I think is one of the fatal flaws that Silicon Valley has had. The people in decision-making powers are of a particular class, they're of a particular race, and most of the time of a particular gender, and they tend to reproduce the kind of technology and the algorithms that they write and the products that they make tend to reproduce their own biases. So I think it's very important sort of the structures that they created and the products that they posited did not anticipate a lot of the negative effects that we see now, which is amplifying inequality and amplifying all of these sort of right-wing extremist sort of voices, because it wasn't even in their worldview. They are not the recipients, for example, of hate speech. They're not the people. They're not women who are constantly being, for years on end, are being trolled online. So I think they did not anticipate that these social media platforms will become very political, highly sort of contested spaces, and the role that information and spread of disinformation, misinformation will have. And a major chunk of this is the algorithms that they have. So the news feeds that we are constantly, that are curated just for us, these social media companies brag that nobody else sees the same exact news feed as another user. They are mining on our data, and they're reproducing a lot of the sort of biases, the inequalities that they have, because they are using data without our permission, without any transparency, but also the algorithms themselves are not transparent. We don't know what content is being prioritized, and what ends up happening is a lot of times that the most sort of vocal, most sort of extreme view is being prioritized and sort of ends up at the at the top of our screen. And this tends to sort of, I was just hearing a podcast today, and this isn't a sort of local example as such, but right before, now we have the US election coming up, and they were interviewing Republicans about the kind of sort of biases that they have, or the kind of impressions that they have about Joe Biden, for example, and who is not obviously far from perfect, but the sort of survey actually showed a lot of disturbing findings. There are a lot of them, a lot of Republicans were reproducing QAnon misinformation and propaganda, calling him a pedophile. I mean, there are credible allegations against him for harassment, but none for pedophilia. And these are sort of really far-right extremist propaganda that is solely being peddled on social media, and around, I think, 2 to 3% of Republicans were believing it. So the way that this information is presented and the way that it's constantly presented ends up sort of, as you said, persuading people. So that's a lot of power that these tech giants have, and they refuse to take responsibility for the misinformation and all of the sort of ills that come from it.
Right. Hija, this rampant spread of misinformation on social media, what do the social media platforms have to gain from this? Especially when we talk about how this causes them to be embroiled in scandals and, pushes them into the spotlight where more and more countries are observing what they do more closely. It seems like, they're digging their own grave with it.
Yeah, so I'll go back to the social dilemma itself. There is a part in the documentary where they, they talk about misinformation, how it spreads on the internet. And for the most part, it's just one line that they mention, that on Twitter, misinformation spreads 6 times faster than the credible information. And it tells you something about the, way these social media companies operate. For example, if I go back to, how Facebook operates, Facebook, runs ads. It's one of the from one of the Cambridge Analytica related hearings that happened in U.S. Senate. When Mark Zuckerberg was questioned for Facebook's role in Cambridge Analytica, the whole scandal. He said that we run ads and that's how we make business. This is their business model, and ads can only be run, or ads can only function better if there is activity on the platform. If social media, if misinformation is spreading 6 times faster than credible information on any platform whatsoever, that means misinformation is getting them more activity from the users as compared to the activity that a credible or true information is getting. So at the end of the day, misinformation is getting them business. And while we can talk about how these companies have a responsibility to regulate how their platform works and how they can minimize spread of misinformation, at the end of the day they would have to change their business model, and changing business model would require them to maybe compromise on the revenues that they are generating. I'll just quote one example of a recent survey that says that during the coronavirus lockdown, Facebook's revenue increased 98%. That tells you something about how people have started using social media. And then, of course, while the usage has increased, you can also see how this abuse of platforms have potentially been increased as well.
That's really interesting you say that, Hija. Very interesting. Why? Because we saw a very, if I can't say the word genuine, but a very active and proactive role by these social media platforms in trying to tackle misinformation during the coronavirus. And yet you're saying that because of this misinformation, they gain more profits?
If they're not making profits through misinformation, they are definitely making profit through the activity that is done through, that people sort of give attention to this misinformation. Like I said, 6 times, misinformation spreads 6 times faster. That means it's, if a credible information is, for example, I'm just going to write that coronavirus does not exist, for example, or it's a made up disease. It's going to take 6 times more attention of people as compared to if I talk in my own bubble. That
so negative information and misinformation specifically, not negative information but misinformation specifically, causes a greater stir on social media, 6 times in fact that of which fact-checked information causes. And Hija, I hear you, and the question that comes to my mind is one that I've voiced many, many times. I've asked many, many times, especially every time we talk about social media. And Shmyla, I'll take this to you. And I think it's an important question to reflect upon each and every time, which is, in all of what we're saying, in our entire conversation, are we not making the mistake of assuming that the user is passive, that the user in fact is just this pawn that can be manipulated in any way that he or she can be manipulated? We're basically depriving the individual of all agency.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point in the sense that, but I think it's very important, and that's why digital rights activists, as Hija was talking about, sort of the responsibility and the immense power that these companies have, because these companies have actively worked to divest the average user of power over time. So, for example, like sort of the lack of transparency that we keep talking about, that has actually made the user less able to understand how their data is used, and then how that data is sort of fed into algorithms and then used to manipulate them. So there is a very clear hierarchy and power imbalance when it comes to the user and the social media companies, and to the extent that they're almost operating like sort of oligarchs or sort of monopolies with unchecked power. That's why one of the few sort of proposals to in sort of the United States and all over the world is to break up the business model and to break up the monopolies that these companies have had. So there is a huge disparity, but I think this is an interesting point to bring up because about the agency of the user, because we've seen that users are also very smart. So a lot of times, like for example, when you see in social movements, both right-wing and sort of towards more progressive groups, they understand how these algorithms work as well. They constantly sort of also actively manipulate these algorithms to trend something, for example. So there is, I think, growing understanding amongst users about the sort of hand that they have been dealt to a certain extent, and they actively negotiate within these sort of structures as well. And this also opens up the sort of avenue for accountability and how the more conversations that we have, as imperfect as the social dilemma is, it also does inform people who might not know about some of these debates and maybe sort of simplifies it. And I completely agree with Hija that it doesn't offer the satisfactory solution that advocates and sort of activists have been offering for a number of years and completely ignores them. But I think there is growing awareness, and a lot of users now know. So a lot of users, for example, are very conscious about sort of posting something online or giving information online. But it's not enough because there is still a huge and an insurmountable structure imbalance there.
Right. So Hija, I'm going to take this next question to you and shift gears a bit. I want to pick up on the point that Shmyla made in regards to, these social media companies having monopolies. And let's talk about Facebook here, which also owns WhatsApp, Instagram, and then along with its main platform, Facebook, of course. Given all of this, how much data does it collect on us, and how much does it know about us? How much through these various platforms does it uniquely extract data in order to understand how we operate, and then, subsequently give us those targeted ads, which really do, frankly, creep out a lot of us?
So this is, a problem or a question that a lot of people actually ask in the digital rights circle as well. The kind of power that Facebook has gathered by, acquiring Instagram and acquiring WhatsApp, and of course, on top of that, its own, the main platform that Facebook is. There is no evidence that suggests that Facebook, listens to your conversations through your microphones. But the idea that when you talk about something and then it starts appearing on your, screens, or it starts being suggested on your screens, it's based on, how these platforms collect your information over time and then suggest what might interest you at any particular time. For example, if I'm thinking about or talking about going on a trip or buying a particular product, for example, I want to buy a moisturizer, and I might have been looking at certain kinds of content online, maybe on Facebook or maybe on Instagram, or might have just been talking to somebody on WhatsApp. It collects. It might not be collecting from WhatsApp, because what they say is WhatsApp is encrypted, and Facebook cannot really look at the conversations that we are having on WhatsApp. But again, Facebook and Instagram, if we look at that, it does have the ability, like Shmyla mentioned about algorithm. It does have the ability to predict our behaviors. It's, very widely said that, these algorithms know us better than we know ourselves, because, they are monitoring each and every stroke of ours that we are doing on the internet. And it's very interesting that Facebook not only tracks you on its own platforms, that is on Facebook and Instagram, it also tracks you outside of its own platforms. It has trackers on, websites that you visit. It has trackers on, for example, any game that you play. So all of these things that you do on your mobile phone or on your laptop, it does track you. All of your internet activity or online activity, it's going back to Facebook. And that has been documented pretty well as well, how Facebook, collects all of this information and how it, forwards it or uses it for its own benefits in terms of, targeted ads, or in terms of how we saw in US general elections in 2016, and also we'll potentially see in November as well how, these platforms are going to be used. So not just on the platform you're being surveilled, but also outside of these platforms as well.
It seems like there's a very, very widespread and deep-seated network that's operating here, that's extracting our information and taking it back to these servers or back to these social media giants. I'm going to have to take a break at that and thank both my guests who joined me, Shmyla Khan from Lahore and Hija Kamran from Karachi. Thank you both for coming on the show, giving us your valuable insight. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, we're going to continue our discussion, so stay with us. Welcome back. We are trying to gain greater insight into the degree to which social media impacts our realities. And while this is a very huge conversation, one that demands of us to continuously come back to the issue and discuss further, we hope that today's show will give us greater insight. Let me introduce my guests who will help us that better. Joining now is Ms. Kristen Ruby, who is the CEO of Ruby Media Group, a public relations and social media agency. She's also an analyst who dissects frequently the issues related to social media, tech trends, and crisis communication. She joins us from New York. Also joining us is Mr. Philip Ingram, who's a journalist specializing in security and the intelligence arena. He joins us from Birmingham. Thank you both for joining us, and a very, very warm welcome to the show. Philip, let me just jump right to you and let's get into it. From your unique perspective, your lens when you deal with security and intelligence, and you try to perceive the threat social media has become to security all around the world, whether it's individuals or states. How enormous is that impact, and how much of that do you think gets exaggerated?
I think the threat is absolutely ginormous. I don't think people understand the digital exposure that they have and the amount of data that they're putting out on social media that can be then taken by people and manipulated in a way that, when it's fed back to them, can actually change the way people think. And this is something that was studied by Dr. Michael Kosinski, who did his PhD in this from Cambridge University. And he brought in a term called psychodemographic profiling, and it's examining people's social media activity and their profiles and being able to predict how they're going to think and work out ways of trying to manipulate that thinking with targeted advertisements and targeted messages.
Right. As you say that this threat is enormous, when we're talking about this growing consciousness, when individuals are growing to become more aware of how social media is impacting their lives, how much of a security threat it is. Given all of this, do you think social media firms are more responsive to this awareness, that they are now trying harder to be aware and conscious of what they do?
I suppose I take the opposite stance here, which is that as marketers, we have been trying to understand this psychographic profiling of target consumers for decades now. And I think the only thing that has really changed is the sheer volume of data that we have access to, and that basically users are voluntarily opting into this. So as the social dilemma says, if it's free, you're the product. So I think to marketers who watch this film on Netflix, we know this inherently. I think the problem is that consumers are just not aware of how much data they are necessarily giving up to use these different tools.
Right. Christine, let me just pick on that point and ask for a clarification in order to understand if this is what you're saying. You're saying that as marketers, what is happening right now, this profiling is not novel, even in the realm of social media?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that as a result of social media, the tools and access to data that we have enable us to build that profile through retargeting and pixels and everything else online at a much larger scale than ever before, and also to create a much more symbolic and representative profile of that user than we ever had access to before.
Philip, on that point there, that Christine is saying that while there's a greater access to information, there is nothing really particularly more insidious in the way it's being done, especially from her point of view. Do you agree with that?
I agree with her when it comes to marketing, because marketing is all about trying to manipulate the thinking of the people that you're putting your messaging out to. And interestingly, Victor Danchu from Bucharest University of Economic Studies in 2014 wrote a paper called Manipulative Marketing, Persuasion and Manipulation of the Customer Through Advertising. Now, the thing that's changed is when you look at the amount of data that can be taken from social media and other posts online and combine that with artificial intelligence, and that picture of the individual that can be put together is in an awful lot more detail than you had with traditional marketing pictures that led advertising in the past. And whenever that data is put together and it's used to have targeted manipulative messages aimed at trying to change the way people are thinking when it comes to big decisions like political thinking or other sorts of thinking at that level, that's whenever it crosses the Rubicon, and there needs to be greater controls of it, and the social media companies are beginning to realize what can be done and are starting to take action, but far too slowly.
Slowly. Christine, now let me understand, because I know nothing about marketing here and you're the expert. So when we say that there is greater access to information, but it's not that different to how it was before. Before, it seemed like all the information that could be extracted about an individual was in the public domain. With social media, there is far greater access to a person's likes, dislikes. And that's truly where individuals don't know how much of their privacy is being invaded. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I would say that's a fair assessment. I think every single like, dislike, every location that you are ever at, all of the metadata behind each photo that you ever upload, it's all on there. Every single click, everything is tracked. And what's fascinating is that users who have tried to delete this data have found that it's very difficult to actually ever truly erase any of it. So every time you are clicking on your phone or going online or using Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or TikTok, what's happening is they are creating this persona of you that can then be retargeted to other advertisers. And so even, for example, when you delete an app, sometimes you'll get an email saying that we want you back, you'll stop getting retargeted around the web. And so that is the insidious nature that the other guest and journalist is referring to, which is in fact correct.
Right. So Mr. Philip Ingram, just one last question to you. The GDPR, the law that has been unveiled in Europe, is being seen as a gold standard for how we should approach social media all across the world. Do you really think that is a gold standard, or that's just the bare minimum that countries need to do in order for us to keep a hold of our information, in order for us to make sure that we have some rights to our information?
I put it as the bare minimum. The difference that the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, has brought in is instead of whenever data is handed over to a social media company or to anyone, that data then belonging to the person that it's been handed over to, the data, the personally identifiable data about an individual is retained as a property of that individual, and it's for them to decide what can be done with it. And if it is misused in a way that they haven't agreed to, then there are actions that can be taken. And the other good thing is that the General Data Protection Regulation dictates that you should have a immutability. You should have the ability to have personally identifiable data or data that you don't want out in the public domain removed. And any company that can't do that is breaking the regulation. And the regulation, whilst it's a European regulation, covers European citizens across the globe.
Right. Just one last question to you before I let you go. I know you are a very busy person with a lot on your docket right now. But Philip, when we're talking about laws keeping up to date with the advances in technology there, what do you think is the main struggle?
Well, the biggest struggle is that changing laws takes many years to do. Changing technology, it's changing on a monthly basis. In the United Kingdom, the principal law for dealing with computer misuse is the Computer Misuse Act 1990. That's 30 years old. In 1990, we didn't have TikTok and LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook and everything else, and therefore it's the law that is in place at the moment does not cover these sorts of things. And governments are going to have to try and find ways of amending laws very, very quickly. And been able to predict what's going to happen in the future so that they've got the right control mechanisms in place. But a government is never going to be able to do that. So they're going to have to bring in a greater social responsibility charter in for different social media companies so that they can ensure that they are carrying out the advanced policing, and it's not always coming into something that needs to be legislated for in different governments.
Right, take your point there. Thank you so much, Mr. Philip Ingram, for joining us and taking out the time to talk to us. Kristen, now there's a couple of things I want to pick up with you. Now, first of all, let's continue with what Philip just said in terms of laws and regulations. Tristan Harris in this documentary stated something that I picked up. I thought it was very interesting. While he compared to these tech experts who are developing these social media platforms to magicians, he said doctors, lawyers, people who know how to build 747 missiles, they don't know more about how their own mind is vulnerable. It's a separate discipline. Do you think that is one of the issues when we're talking about laws and regulations to be applied to social media? It's a completely different discipline that can be compared to anything else.
I think, again, it goes back to the standard principles of advertising and marketing persuasion and how to win friends and influence people, except not in person, but online. So I don't think that, again, a lot of the things that were brought up in the social dilemma on Netflix are necessarily that novel of ideas. And I think the most fascinating part of that documentary is the fact that the actual people who work in big tech all said that they limit screen time and social media usage for their children. So I think that is a big takeaway here, that the people that are actually creating these apps and these programs don't want their own kids using them. That was the scariest part of that film for me.
Right. I take that that's such an important and startling fact. I mean, of course it is, because it just shows how they know how dangerous these platforms are. Stay with me, Christine. I'd also like to introduce Nogueira Sousa, who is a political analyst, podcaster, and member of the Brazilian political organization. He joins us from Sao Paulo. Thank you so much, Nogueira, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, as we are talking about the impact social media has on security, it has on different facets of life, and how much of it should we be scared about, I want to talk about the unique impact it has on politics and influencing politics. Take us through it from your perspective.
Well, social media in general, like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, it reflects in a certain way the values of the liberal Western world. So, for example, if we take individualism, ultra-individualism, we just have to check our profiles of someone's profile to check that there is an individual which is the center of attention, a spectacle. We are sharing everything we want, and then the algorithms creates bubbles in which it recommends only like-minded individuals. So instead of we having a community, a group where we discuss our social issues, we are just having a mirror of with our own reflection. Like, we are creating mass of individuals, like radical individuals sometimes, when we have a sense of radical extremists, political parties. We have the flat earthers, for example, and then we create all this social instability, which is a consequence of these liberal individualistic values that we have on social media, which are reflected there.
Right. Christine gets something that's related to the political climate and social media. We saw a boycott movement gaining momentum in terms of putting pressure on Facebook for hate speech, but that didn't seem to put quite the expected dent on Facebook's revenue, perhaps on its image, but that too was restricted. So let me ask you this: how much power do advertisers and marketers really have on Facebook, which is the giant right now?
I think that advertisers and marketers think that, or believe that they have much more power than they do when it comes to these boycotts. And that's a byproduct of cancel culture in general. So some cancel culture or cancellations are able to take off. But when you're going up against these basically utilities and massive conglomerates like a Facebook, unfortunately, as you said, they're not going to be able to make a big enough dent. And so, I do think, however, that when we talk about Facebook and the political spectrum, most recently they reported that they were able to sign up more than 2.5 million people to register them to vote. So because they are in the public eye right now, so much so that, and they've had so many public relations scandals, they are actually trying to, I think, change that public perception of how the platform is used in this election.
Right. Now, being in the public eye, this isn't new for these platforms. I mean, when there was a genocide in Myanmar, which continues to this day, Facebook's role was highlighted in it. When there were lynchings taking place in India because of WhatsApp fake messages, that was again highlighted. All of this combined, it never seems really to bring about the reform that we're expecting.
Well, so the reason for that is because they're not necessarily regulated yet. And I think on some level, these platforms know that they cannot remain unregulated forever. And so I think until the government sort of comes in and enforces that regulation, they can get away with basically whatever they want.
I'm going to cut to you, put my last question to you, Kristen, but I'm going to put in another question to Nogueira there. And Nogueira, now, when we're talking about the type of things that are enabled because of social media, or perhaps not even enabled, but it creates a fertile ground for certain types of things to continue. How much do you think today's political issues are related to how they have been presented on social media in terms of polarization, in terms of hate speech?
Well, the algorithms play a huge role on that because, as I had said, it recommends people based on similar tastes, like-minded people. So, example, if I'm a radical, probably Facebook or Twitter are going to recommend me other radicals to talk to. So we don't have a true political dialogue to discuss our issues. So we have an ascension of extreme parties in politics this way. Of course, Facebook or Twitter or Instagram now are trying to avoid that. They are creating other super intelligent algorithms trying to avoid that, but that creates a paradox because if even though we live in a kind of liberal democracy where we can speak freely, we have a kind of freedom of expression. On the other hand, these algorithms create an automatic censorship of things, so that creates even more radicalization because people are not being able to express themselves freely because of these algorithms. They censor a lot of things automatically because they're trying to keep these bubbles, in check, not sharing their opinions. And then we create even more radicalization. So in a certain way, I think social media are reflecting, the darkest side of these things. They're showing the margins, the people who were at the edge. They didn't have a voice before. Now they have it, but they are being isolated in bubbles, and they are being, social media are contributing to make them radicalized and in politics. And then it creates this polarization between different extremes of people.
So it's helping to promote the polarization. It's widening the fault lines within society that already exist. I take your point there. Kristen, just one last question to you. And I'm going to relate this to a conversation we had in a previous episode about TikTok, where you said it is necessary for the United States government to intervene, to take strict actions. And as you say this, as you said this, and when you say that, these social media platforms know that they will not remain unregulated forever, so they're going to have to mend their ways. Why is there such a lag in trying to regulate them? Because we seem to have an example of when, there's enough political momentum to actually take action, there is strict action taken. when we take the example of TikTok, and yet we see that action or the lack of action, therefore, is, very evident in the case of these other social media platforms.
I would say a primary example of this would be Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act here, which has not really been revised or amended in several years. And so I think if you look at Trump's social media executive order that he put forth, that is a primary example of someone saying, wait a second, these platforms are not going to deserve or get blanket immunity if XYZ doesn't change, right? And so I think that is really the answer to your question, which is that technology has not, or the laws have not kept up with technology. Technology has moved so much faster than the laws. And unfortunately, in America, it takes so long to really change some of these core laws. So we have this problem where we have all of these new tools, but we have laws that have not basically kept up in time and in accordance with artificial intelligence, machine learning, these algorithm changes, and social media platforms. So that is really the big disconnect. One other thing that I will say back to the point of the other guests that I think is important to say here is that we can blame as much as we want of this on the algorithms, but at the end of the day, polarization is also partially on you, the user. You control who you surround yourself with. And so from my experience, I like to surround myself with people from both sides of the political spectrum, but I also know people that don't. And so you have a say and a choice in who you choose to connect with and what political beliefs and systems you keep around you at all times. And if you want to try to fight that algorithm, the best thing that you can do as a user is to keep adding people from both sides of the aisle and keep making sure that, you're hearing different perspectives and then make your opinions accordingly to what you think.
I take you there, and we're unfortunately short on time, so I'm going to have to end the segment here. It's such an interesting conversation, and there's so much more to learn. As I said before, that we have to continuously come back to this topic, discuss how social media is impacting us, the various pieces of the puzzle that we learn with time. We need to keep discussing them, because that's how we're going to evolve in terms of our knowledge and our awareness. Thank you so much, Ms. Christine Ruby, for joining us from New York, Nogueira Sousa for joining us from Sao Paulo. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.